In part 1, we went over some of my earliest memories of the arcade and the home conversions I had on the Atari 2600. These games were my introduction to the hobby and some of my favorite software during the golden age of the arcade. We went over stuff like Pac-Man, Zaxxon, and Frogger, true classics in every sense of the word. But that was only the beginning, and we have a long way to go before the story is finished. In this episode, we're going to move on a few years to the Christmas of 1986, when I got my brand new Nintendo Entertainment System. I had known about it for over a year thanks to a few friends getting it, and when I finally got one to call my own, I was so excited to play everything I could. For the next 3 years, I would rent, borrow, trade, and pretty much do everything in my power to play as much as possible, and boy, it was a hell of a ride. In this episode, we will be going over the arcade games and their home conversions I'd be playing from 1986 to 1989, talk a bit about how they turned out, and even touch upon a few of the other home systems I'd played during this stretch. I hope you guys enjoy the arcade experience at home, part 2. My early days with the NES of course started with the so-called black box games, a collection of titles that included a number of arcade ports. The ones that caught my eye immediately were favorites like Donkey Kong, Popeye, Kung Fu, and Mario Brothers. These games were very close to their arcade counterparts in visuals and sound, impressing me well beyond what I had played at home before it. Had the NES been released in the United States in 1983, this would have meant it would have been capable of nearly one-to-one arcade ports and would have been the best thing ever. The problem was that arcade gaming had seen a massive push in technology by 1986, so while these older games held up great on the NES, newer arcade games were orders of magnitude more impressive in regards to graphics and sound. This actually created a situation very similar to what I experienced on the Atari 2600. Some games were great arcade ports, while others suffered mightily. During the journey, I encountered plenty of both, and we're going to take a look at some of them now. Before I jump into this, I want to be clear that I'm focusing on actual arcade ports here. While I love games like Rygar, Ninja Gaiden, and Bionic Commando, the NES versions were entirely different from the arcade, and I'm not covering them in this video. These are good old-fashioned arcade games converted to home releases. When I first played the 1985 Capcom hit Ghosts 'n Goblins, it whooped my 10-year-old ass up one side the arcade and down the other. Oh my god, was it hard. Right from the opening stage, it showed you no mercy, no quarter, and was out to steal as many of those as it could. It looked great too. Arcade games had begun to ditch their single-screen roots and had begun to scroll more and more, making each world seem much larger and giving you a feeling like you were exploring something. Your little dude and his enemies had great animation, well beyond the stuff you typically saw. When it hit the NES in 1986, the port was relatively solid. While the color and animation took some hits, it still looked and played mostly like it should. The difficulty was still there, the scrolling was smooth, and it had the stages, bosses, and ending for a complete package. Far from perfect, but given the power difference, this was a damn solid version of the arcade. Shoot 'em up started out pretty simple in the arcade, but by the time we got to 1985's Gradius, there had been some huge improvements in graphics, sound, and gameplay. I really loved the way the weapons upgrade bar showed what you had and what you could get. I also appreciated the level design and music here. It's one of the first shoot 'em ups that I can honestly say the sound made me want to play it. Konami had done a killer job taking a genre I had cared little about and making it one of my new favorites. And the NES continued that fine piece of software at home with a stellar conversion. Don't get me wrong, it saw a host of changes and omissions, but the gameplay and the great soundtrack really held up. It was one of my favorite NES games early on, and one of the first Famicom games I bought when I began collecting for it. SNK's Akari Warriors had been quite popular in the arcade when it was released. The two-player vertically scrolling run-and-gun gameplay was intense and challenging. There was always loads of enemies on the screen, and you even got to commandeer tanks to blast your enemies. In a way, it was Metal Slug 10 years before that showed up on the Neo Geo. The NES home version was heavily cut back in every area. The gameplay feels quite a bit different as well. The number of enemies and speed is perhaps the most glaring downgrade, but don't be fooled into thinking that makes this one easy. It's not at all. This will chew up newcomers and feed them to the wood chipper. Having not played it in a long time, it absolutely wiped the floor with me. Like a lot of NES arcade ports, the music actually holds up pretty well here. I loved me some Spy Hunter. Your job is to hunt down enemy vehicles in your supercar and take them out. Every so often you can even transform your vehicle into a boat for some water action. You gotta be careful though, there are civilians out there you gotta watch for. It was fast, fun, and hard as hell. Sunsoft brought it home to the NES and surprise, it was a damn good conversion. It kept the arcade speed, the gameplay was spot on, and hot damn did it have some great music. It's pure adrenaline-fueled chaos. When Contra showed up in the arcade, it pushed a lot of things forward. Run and guns weren't anything new in 1987, but it really changed my thinking on them. Large sprites, great co-op, and some of the best boss battles I had ever seen. It was an instant hit with me and my friends, and when we found out it was released for the NES, it was a must-play immediately. While the home port is based on the arcade content, this may be the very first game I had ever encountered that I thought was actually better at home. The visuals take some hits, but everything else here is point blank a better experience. The soundtrack is A+, the gameplay is faster and smoother, it keeps the two-player co-op, and though the levels are a bit mixed up, most of the content is here. This is a classic and just one example where the developers had the good sense to take the arcade content and make it even better. For those interested, the Japanese version has more content than the North American release. There are new cinematics, music, and the stages have new animations in the background. Double Dragon was the kind of game that was made for the arcade. 2 players, memorable music, hard as hell. I mean, the staples were there for a classic. It pretty much was too. Technos Japan crafted a beat-em-up that had you punching, kicking, jumping, grabbing, elbowing, kneeing, and throwing your enemies all over the screen. There are even weapons like dynamite, knives, and baseball bats to even the playfield a bit. When you really think about it, it was quite a step up from much of the other games we had seen from the genre. A home port naturally had the attention of many of us back then, and the NES game was pretty damn solid overall. It lost the 2-player co-op, which is a shame, but it kept much of the enemy and stage design the same. It gained a level up system where you get new moves as you play, but I was not a huge fan of this. There is still a 2-player mode, but it comes in the form of a versus battle option, and the music here is freaking unforgettable. Life Force was quite the impressive evolution of what Konami started with Gradius. It changed up the setting quite a bit, covered both horizontal and vertical shooting stages, and had massive boss fights. The US release was a remix of the Japanese shooter Salamander, now taking place inside an alien body with organic enemies. It was something to see in the arcade way back then, so I expected the home version to be butchered top to bottom. Not so. The NES really kicked some serious ass here. It's mostly based on the biological changes that were made to the US arcade version, and like the NES version of Gradius before it, does that content very proud. Life Force had a killer soundtrack, great graphics, and even has the 2-player co-op. I loved this game as a kid, and it was definitely one you just gotta have for your collection. Rampage was the type of game I was drawn to in the arcade. I could play it with my friends, and the only goal was to bust shit up. What more could you want? This one was sort of a dream come true. It took an old love for Godzilla movies and put me in the role of a giant monster raising hell. I really dug the setup, and it was a great looking game too. Buildings smashed up real good, and the little people and vehicles made you feel like you were 10 stories tall. But man, did the NES butcher this game. I hated the way it looked, it sounded worse, and I just didn't find the gameplay all that appealing. I had trouble doing simple things like climbing buildings, and bashing things just didn't feel the same. I know some of you like it, but this was a big miss for me. I always loved when an arcade game would come along and present a slightly new take on an old formula. Jackal took a simple shoot 'em up and added POWs that needed rescuing while you gunned down enemy troops and vehicles. Best part is that you had the run of the play area, allowing you to go where you wanted when you wanted. It had 2 weapons from the outset, a machine gun and grenades, but the latter could be upgraded to various types of missile launchers. 2 players could play it together too, adding to the appeal. The NES port kept everything that made the arcade great, sans a hit to color and detail. My friends and I played the ever-loving hell out of this. The gameplay rivals Contra in terms of multiplayer fun, and there isn't much like it on the NES. There was a time when Konami was one of the best developers on the planet, and their NES output is simply legendary. There was a ton of love for bad dudes in the arcade. Data East did the game, a 1988 release that featured 2-player co-op and beat-em-up style gameplay. The evil dragon ninja have kidnapped the president, and it's up to you to get him back. The gameplay is kind of a mix of a few different arcade titles. It's got a bit of Kung Fu Master, a dash of Shinobi, and a trickle of the Double Dragon games. It all added up to a good-looking title that was really fun. When the NES port dropped, I was not impressed, however. The gameplay felt so clunky, and even the screen didn't scroll all that well. The hit detection was kinda screwy too, almost like your attacks took another second to register on some of the enemies. There was a ton of sprite flicker as well. Enemies, especially bosses, are always flashing, and when 2 enemies or more hit the screen, it became a blink fest. I don't know, man, some of you played the ever-loving hell out of this as kids. I know my friends did, but this was one port I just never could get into.
Got it.
As the NES got older, arcade games had begun to pass it by in such huge strides that ports really began to suffer visually. It had a great audio chip that held its own, but man were things falling apart in the graphics department. As a big fan of the film Robocop, you can imagine my love of the arcade when it was released. It was a gorgeous game of great voice samples and music straight from the movie. The gameplay was simple enough, but it had enough style and visual fortitude to be something provocative. But all that came crashing down in the NES port. We lost the killer graphics, the voices, and just about everything that had made the arcade stick out. It wasn't that it was necessarily a bad game, it just was a shell of a much better experience. It was 1989, and it was time for me to move on to newer hardware.
You are under arrest. Drop it!
You can't talk about the arcade and Nintendo in the 1980s and not mention the Versus system and the PlayChoice 10. These were two platforms that were based on the technology that powered the NES. The Nintendo Versus system was released in the United States in 1984 and had games like Versus Tennis, Versus Duck Hunt, and Versus Baseball. Other games like Mach Rider, Excite Bike, and Super Mario Bros. Saw eventual release as well. Many of these were sort of reverse conversions, where the existing Famicom game was taken and modified a bit in terms of visuals and difficulty. This was a very popular arcade platform for Nintendo, and its success is one of the main catalysts for the company's confidence to release the NES in North America. Nintendo wasn't done pimping the NES in the arcade with the Versus system either. In 1986, they released the PlayChoice 10, a machine that was similar in ideology to Data East Deco cassette system, and the later released Neo Geo. Here you could add up to 10 ROM boards to the unit, with each game offering hints and strategies via a second screen. The games were governed by timers and featured some of the NES platform's biggest hits, like Tecmo Bowl, Ninja Gaiden, and the Mario titles. I remember seeing these machines quite a bit in the arcades at the time, and often played Castlevania and Mike Tyson's Punch-Out at my local Sears. Both the Versus system and the PlayChoice 10 created incredible gateway opportunities for Nintendo. Those that had not gotten an NES yet could see what all the fuss was about right there in the local arcade. While these games lacked the wow factor of the more advanced games at the time, every title released on these two platforms could be played at home virtually unchanged, a huge selling point for the NES. The Master System was a complete mystery to me the first few years it was on the market. I was lucky to have gotten an NES back then, and for a time, I didn't know a single person that owned a Master System. Hell, I had never seen one sold at a retail store back then. Lucky for me, my best friend Robert got one for his birthday a while after I had gotten my NES, allowing me to have access to some of the games for that platform. Perhaps unfairly, I had loved Sega's growth in the arcade with their superscalers, so it was those games I wanted to play most on the Master System. Initially, I had been utterly disappointed in what I had found. Games like Space Harrier, Afterburner, Thunderblade, and Outrun were so heavily cut back, I just couldn't enjoy them very much. They looked different, sounded different, and most importantly, played different from their arcade versions. But things didn't stay that way for long. While the superscalers had been a letdown, I found plenty elsewhere to love about the Master System. Roston was a great port of the arcade, it had a unique soundtrack and the gameplay was quite close in feel. Rampage point blank blew the NES edition away. I mean, it's not even close. It's a better port in every category and one of my favorites on the platform. Sega's own Shinobi took a hit in detail, but was still a killer side-scrolling action game. The NES tried to give it some love, but the Master System version simply did it so much better. There were plenty of other great arcade ports too. Paperboy, R-Type, Super Off-Road, and Wonder Boy, just to name a few, but I quickly found that Sega had some big problems that made me realize the NES was what I wanted to support. Outside of next to no one actually owning a Sega Master System, the games were hard to find, and when you did actually find a store that carried them, the selection was minuscule next to the NES. Nintendo had slit Sega's throat with some questionable business practices, and it had reduced any chances of success for them in the United States. The Master System was a fine platform. I grew to love it quite a bit over the years, but Nintendo's crippling effects cannot be denied. Also during my run with the NES, one of my friends got an Atari 7800. I hadn't known a lot about it when he got his in the summer of 1987. Hell, to be truthful, I didn't even know Atari still existed at that point. I had not been impressed with the 5200, so they fell off my radar. But you know what? The 7800 didn't seem like a bad console for older arcade ports. I had initially played games like Miss Pac-Man and Galaga, which were really solid, but the overall tiny library and lack of modern third-party titles really hammered my interest in it. My friends and I would enjoy a game of Food Fight here and there, but by the time we got to play games like Double Dragon and Rampage, it was clear the NES was the system to own in North America. Once my friend moved away in 1989, he took his 7800 with him, and I have never seen or played another one since. As the NES aged into 1990, arcade games had become graphical spectacles well beyond its capability. Most of the machine's better games were designed specifically for it, leaving direct arcade ports a much smaller footprint in the library. When a developer did try and tackle something more modern, the cutbacks were unreal. A release like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, was a massive step back from the arcade version in regards to sound and visuals. Luckily, the old NES was able to still provide some excellent gameplay. In fact, this would become the system's strength as it aged. There were many game releases loosely based on arcade games, but with big changes to the design to take better advantage of the lower spec hardware. Games like Double Dragon 2 were still excellent, and even Nintendo themselves reinvented some of their arcade ideas into massive hits like Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! As a dedicated fan of the arcade, I had really enjoyed my time with the NES and its massive library. It did the older stuff a ton of justice, and even when it couldn't match the visuals of the coin-op originals, the gameplay was still there in many instances. As with all home hardware at the time, newer technology meant arcade games really started to outpace its ability to remain competitive. When games like Strider and Final Fight released in 1989, it was clear the arcade was still king. My love and fascination of these games demanded that I find the best way to play them at home, and it just so happened that a few new 16-bit platforms were ready to redefine my expectations. In part 3, we will take a look at the TurboGrafx 16, Sega Genesis, and Super Nintendo, and how they handled the arcade games of the era. Was it closer than ever, or did they get left behind like all the rest? I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.